Hey ladies and gentlemen, stoked to have you here as today we debate whether or not we still need religion, and we are starting right now. Hey everybody, thrilled to have you here for this very special Sunday afternoon debate. This is going to be a lot of fun. For me, these are honestly a blast. And today is going to be especially fun. This is one of my favorite debate topics. So this is one of the ones that I'm like, ooh, I'd love to. This is one I get to hope to debate this summer. But more importantly, right now we are debating it. These two have prepped. They are well read and ready to go. And I want to let you know their links are down in the description. So if you like what you're hearing, you can check it out there. Or if you don't like what you're hearing, you're like, oh, I can't stand that, you can go and troll them at their webpage all you want. So we actually, you know what? They're gonna grow on you. Even if you don't like them, you're gonna be like, you know what? They're growing on me. I like these. So with that, don't want to take any more time. I want to quick let you know about the format. So today, what we're going to have is 10-minute openings from each speaker, then a 5-minute response from each speaker, followed by 45 minutes of open dialogue, and then we're going to have 25 minutes of Q&A. So, my heart's going. So, with that, I want to introduce our speakers. This is Nick, and Nick has links down in the description as mentioned, and he's just going to share just a couple sentences about what he's been up to in terms of projects. And Nick, thanks so much for coming on. This is the first time we got to have you, and we're glad you're here.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Glad to be here. Thank you, SJ. This is, I'm delighted. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter. I am the author of The Water Thief, which was a rebuttal. It was a novelized rebuttal to Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I also wrote Confessions of a Sin Eater, the memoirs of a prison psychologist. He was a psychologist, did 10 years work at Walpole Maximum Security Prison. And I also own and run the Humanist Codex, which is a website of theistic and atheist arguments, and it's also a social networking site and support site for people who are struggling with deconversion from theism.
You bet. Well, we're glad to have you here, Nick, and SJ, also looking forward to hearing what you've been up to. So thanks for being here as well, SJ.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to come on. And I have to say, I listened to Nick chat a little bit about that rebuttal that he wrote to Ayn Rand's book. And so I'm somewhat familiar with that. And I find it very interesting. He looked at a different perspective with respect to sociology. I'm sorry, not sociology, I mean to say socialism. So I think that's pretty fascinating stuff. And I think that'll even be part of our conversation today, a little bit on socialism and capitalism, because I really enjoy that stuff. And so we'll be mentioning a little bit about that. And I got the color memo. Look at our coloring here, James. Do you see what you're wearing and what I'm wearing?
That's the very, very sharp, SJ. I have to compliment you on that color scheme.
I haven't. It's kind of funny that you're wearing the same colors. But anyway, so I am a university professor. I teach business management field. So I teach leadership and human resource management. And this summer, for one of the first times, I'm teaching an MBA class on business communication. So I'm really excited about that. And that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Actually, I start in just a couple of weeks again for our summer sessions. And I have a blog site that's got over 100 articles about Christianity and defending it against atheism. And you can find that at christian-apologist.com, or you can find me on social media at LEAD1225, LEAD1225, and that's it.
You bet. Well, we're stoked to have both of you here, and want to mention as well, we forgot to mention at the start, if you are new here, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we are trying to build an eclectic community. And so whether you're Christian, atheist, Muslim, you know, whoever you are, we're glad you're here. And also, hopefully you learn something new, because we really do strive to have that kind of diversity of thought. So with that, we've already explained the format. I'm going to set the clock for, given that we usually have the affirmative go first, SJ would be taking the affirmative on us still needing religion today. So she'll go first, and I have the clock set for 10 minutes, and I will start it on your first word.
Did we change that to 5? I'm perfectly fine with 10, and it doesn't need to be strict to me, but I thought we had considered changing that to 5.
Sorry about that. I must have missed that when I was setting 5. Is that good?
I'm cool if she takes 10 as well. I am fine. I'm fine either way.
You bet. 5 to 10 minutes. They're pretty flexible, so we appreciate you being flexible, and sorry about that I was a little bit inattentive there. But the floor is yours, SJ, and for sure no more than 10 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for having me on, and thank you to anyone here who's listening. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think we'll start off talking a little bit about what life was like back in the Roman Empire. And one of the things that we know from back in the Roman Empire is that there was much depravity. And a lot of that has even been identified in archaeology. So archaeological findings have found dishes and things like that that show a lot of levels of human depravity. Infanticides were very common. Sexual immorality was very common. Adultery was very common, to the point where some speakers had actually commented about how Christian women were really quite a bit different from the typical morality of the pagans during that time. And so when Christianity came about, and the early Christians, before 313, when it was legalized, when they were practicing with no legal protections, they were very peace-loving people, and they were completely different to what society was like back then. And Christians were behind a Christian emperor was behind the end of the Roman gladiator period, where they used to send people out into the Colosseum to be killed or mauled by animals and that kind of thing. Christians were persecuted very heavily back then, sporadically, but very heavily in the first few hundred years. And they were just a very peace-loving, good people. They started hospitals, like, for example, St. Basil in Caesarea in 369, started a hospital that was open to all. So the Romans and the Greeks had hospitals back then, but they didn't open them up to all. They were primarily for soldiers and those sorts of people, and for people who are of higher economic status. So that was something that Christians brought about. And then over the centuries, Christians have been very involved in things like education and science and good things like that. So we've got people like Galileo and Kepler, and I could probably go on with a pretty long list of some really good Christian people through the centuries. And then Christians were very involved in starting universities like Oxford and Harvard and other Ivy League universities that are still operating today. So Christians have done a really good job through the centuries. And probably one of the things that I think is one of the greatest strengths of Christianity is the fact that we feel like there's an accountability. So we feel like there's an external accountability that holds us accountable for our actions. And so we try to act accordingly with that. And I think if we eliminated the idea of religion, and I like to especially focus on Christianity, that accountability, that external force is gone. And if you look at a person like Peter Hitchens, who wrote a book called Rage Against God, he spoke of the time when he had become an atheist. And he, like his brother Christopher Hitchens, who somewhat recently perished, but he spoke of a time when he had become an atheist, and he felt like the sky was the limit. He could do anything because nobody was going to hold him accountable. And he said during those years, he did do some things that he's very embarrassed about, and he's very sorry to his family for those sorts of things. My claim is not that you need Christianity to be a moral person, but my claim is that it's helpful to help people remember why they want to be moral people. And we have a standard against which we judge our morality, and that's God. So I wanted to say that. And the other thing that I wanted to touch on today, and I won't do it in the first 5 minutes, but I was going to touch on some of the health benefits of religiosity. And so I've identified benefits such as lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicide. I've got meta-analytic studies that I've linked in this. I gave them to James before, so you can actually see the studies that I have that have shown a number of positive benefits to religiosity. There's other things like happiness and that sort of thing, lifestyle satisfaction. There are a number of very positive outcomes to religiosity and church attendance, and especially intrinsic religiosity, which is sort of the belief inside that God exists. And so I'll talk a little bit about the health benefits. And another thing I'll be touching on in a little while is on the idea of capitalism and what capitalism has done for society and how it corresponds to even going back to the time of Christ with the parable of the talents. Christ actually encouraged us to work hard and to invest. And we see that not only in the Gospels, but we also see it mentioned from Paul when he told people if they don't work, they're not going to be able to eat. And we see it in the Proverbs when we The idea of working hard is mentioned quite a bit, and the idea of being lazy is not favorable. And what we found is even at the very beginning of society in the United States, there were some colonies that came from England that started off as socialist, but people became lazy because they felt like if they worked really hard, it wouldn't really matter. So those floundered until they turned around and became capitalist. And capitalist isn't the bad name that some people give it. It really means free enterprise and free markets. And our founding fathers gave us property rights in the Constitution and highlighted the idea of what Max Weber called the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. So that's one way that Christianity has been linked to capitalism, which has led to a very significant middle class in the United States, lots of innovation, lots of entrepreneurship, lots of good stuff. And so it's benefited us to have come this way, and Christians have been at the helm in many capitalist organizations, and even in our founding fathers, in our group of founding fathers. So I'll turn it over to Nick.
You got it. Thanks so much, SJ. And Nick, looking forward to hearing from you as well. So I've got the timer set, and the floor is yours. I think you might have yourself.
Yeah, I muted that. Sorry. When I get up and walk around, sometimes I mute it so that people can't hear me clanging around in the rest of the house. All right. Well, thank you again for having me. I'd like to plant a couple of flags in a couple of different places as we're starting. First, I'd like to point out what sort of everybody knows, but I'd like to reiterate it. The topic of this debate is, do we still need religion? Now, that needs to be dissected for a couple of reasons. First is, and I find this interesting, it's probably not relevant, but the word still is in there, so it implies that we did in fact once need religion. And the reason I'm planting a flag there is because people who know me know that I don't actually believe that. And I think we probably never needed religion. But that's really off the table for this debate, and I am more than happy to, for the purposes of this debate, see, for argument's sake, that we did need it, because that is in fact sort of, it's a bit of a loaded question, but that's in there, and I agreed to it. So I am happy to, for the sake of argument, cede that point, but for the sake of those who are watching and who know me, I am not actually necessarily ceding that point outside of this debate, but for this debate, I certainly grant it. The other thing is, when we talk about, do we still need religion? The question there isn't, did we need it in the past? Again, I'm willing to for the sake of argument, cede that, but that's not the question, nor does that need to be established. The question is, do we need it going forward? Now, in order for someone to make the claim that we need it going forward, you would have to say that religion would provide something that you cannot get outside of religion. If everything that religion provides, that we in fact need, can also be provided by other secular sources, then the conclusion must necessarily be, no, we don't need religion. Is it useful? Does it have some utility? It may well. I think, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but my belief is that whatever utility it has is outweighed by just the significant havoc it wreaks on society, and that in fact, our improvements in the human race, especially over the last couple hundred years, are exclusively due to us removing religion from the public sphere. In private, fine, but in the public sphere, the more we pull religion out of society, the better we do. And so not only do I think that it doesn't necessarily, all the utility can be gotten from somewhere else, I think that none of the utility is essential, and therefore, no, we do not need it going forward. But again, what its successes have been in the past are, I think, reasonably immaterial for that point. So, and then the only other thing, I think we may have some distinctions between deism and theism. I'm assuming that everyone's reasonably familiar with that, but deism being a belief in a higher power of some kind, and theism being a belief specifically that one can either interact or know this higher power and may receive instructions from that higher power. In this case, religion would probably cover both, although I do admit a significant distinction between the two in terms of the damage that they may cause. The other thing I'd like to point out is, as SJ said, I imagine we're going to stick reasonably to Christianity. Both of us are far more familiar with that. But this is not a debate on was Jesus real? Is the Bible real? These are tenets of one specific faith. And that is no more important than necessarily saying, was Odin real? The question is, do we need religion? So while I'd love to have a debate on the truth of the Bible, say, one does not necessarily need to establish that or refute it in order for this debate to have meaning and for us to address the central question. So I think that's it. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks so much, Nick. And with that, we'll go into the 5-minute responses. So, do I get this right, the format for the 5-minute responses?
I imagine the responses maybe take a little bit more time, take some of the time that we'd originally have. We're sort of winging it, and then we're going to have a discussion anyway, so maybe the 5 or 10 minutes for the responses is fine with me if it is with SJ.
Deal.
That's fine.
We'll set it for 10. Thanks for your patience on me being a little bit scattered. With that, SJ, the clock is set for 10 minutes, of which you can use however much you want.
Okay, well, Nick made a very important point, and he said, well, if religion is needed, then we should be able to point out to something that religion provides that if it's not around, that we won't have anymore. And so a lot of people who are secular humanists tend to say, well, we're humanist. And as we have our own human morals, and actually studies have indicated that secular humanists and even atheists also adhere to things like the Golden Rule. There's a study I've mentioned before on your channel by Kinnear and colleagues in 2000, and pointed out with studies of all the major world religions, and he pointed it out with secular humanists, the United Nations, and atheists. All of them focus on this idea that we should do something for the greater good, that we should be moral, basically, we should do the right thing, and that we should follow the Golden Rule, which is to treat others as we would want ourselves treated. So there's these objective moral duties that we have, and I would make the argument that without God, and I look at this from the theistic perspective, not the deistic perspective, but without God, we wouldn't have these objective moral duties to do what's right. And so if we go back and we look at where this came from, we have an objective moral standard, which I would say is God, and these objective moral duties that the entire world shares, where we know that we ought to be benevolent. And so the idea of benevolence comes from Schwartz. He studied that, and he was absolutely astonished in 2012 when he found that of all, thousands and thousands of people all around the world know that they ought to be benevolent. That is the highest moral value of all in every single country. And he was shocked about that. He wondered where that came from. And I would make the argument that that came from God. And I would also make the argument that if we look at societies today as far as needing a religion, and I look at the Globe studies, which is by House, Hanges, Dorfman, and Vippen. If I look at the Globe studies, which came out in 2004, I would find something rather astonishing, is which countries are in the Globe studies that happen to have the lowest levels of religion right now. So if you look at something like Germany, Germany has the lowest level of religion. It's one of the lowest levels of religion. China is actually the lowest, but Germany's right there. Gallup poll, World Value Surveys, other studies have found that a lot of Europe is becoming increasingly secular, where they call it Euro-secularization. And one of the things they found in these different cultures is the idea that changes have been occurring. In the Gallup poll, it said that about half of the people in many countries in Europe, excluding Malta, which is a notable exception, but about half the people in these countries don't believe in God. So there are a lot of people who don't believe in God, or they're just trending away from religion in a pretty big way. And what is that ushering in? So their trend away from religion has ushered in different values. For example, in the Globe study, they found that the practices in Germany in humane orientation, which is another way to say benevolence, are the lowest of all countries in the entire world. So people in Germany have the lowest levels of humane orientation, which is pretty interesting. Other things that we've seen propping up in Europe that have been ushered in are more countries right now are opting for a pro-choice stance on abortion. We just saw that happen in Ireland. Transgenderism in children has markedly risen, where people are making more and more appointments to a shocking extent in places like the United Kingdom, which is, again, has become increasingly atheistic. Bestiality brothels have been popping up. Sex doll brothels, where people have these dolls that they go and have sex with in a certain room, have been popping up. So we've noticed a lot of very depraved practices that I would say remind me of what happened in the Roman Empire. And so this is what the outcomes are when people become increasingly atheistic. So I would say that we need to get back on our moral compass, pay attention to it, and follow it appropriately, because it's posing some pretty awful changes in the world.
Gotcha. And with that, Nick, your rebuttal is ready. We have the timer set for 10 minutes. I'll start it on your first word. Thanks, SJ.
All right, thank you. A few things that I'd like to cover in that. First, on the opening. One of the interesting things that SJ said in her opening was, quote, "My claim is not that you need religion to be moral." Let me say that again. My claim is not that you need religion to be moral. So again, if we're talking about do you need religion, well, if you don't need it to be moral, then that is one area in which you can no longer claim we need religion, because I do agree that we need it to be moral. But if you don't need religion to do that, then you do not need religion. Now, I am happy to discuss whether or not religion has utility in that area. I'm more than happy to discuss that. But again, to the topic of do we need religion, the second you say what she said in her opening, you do not need religion to be moral, it seems to me we've taken morality off the table for that discussion. But in dealing with a few other things, let's see. And it's bad when you cannot read it's bad when you cannot read your own handwriting. Yes, there are concepts that have been in all religions, or many religions, concepts like the Golden Rule, which has existed since well before Jesus. It wasn't called the Golden Rule until the Bible, but we have had those concepts. However, there is no indication that that is exclusively to religion. And in fact, the fact that we have them across all religions implies that they are in fact ours, and that we put them onto the religions that we create, not that we get them from a higher power. Further, even if there was a God, let's assume that there is a God, a higher power of some kind. If there was no religion, that God would ostensibly still be there. So the question isn't, when we talk about morality, the question is, how would we behave without religion? Not necessarily without a God. You don't need whether a God does or does not exist, and whether or not we are aware of his existence. But when it comes to morality, this exists in all beings. We all have a moral intuition that is relative to our intelligence. For example, and we collect these YouTube videos on the Codex, videos of animals doing selfless things. A horse feeding another horse that can't reach its food, so the horse literally passes the hay on. Which God did that horse pray to? When a dog dives across 4 lanes of traffic, risking its own life to rescue another dog, how did religion help this dog become more moral? When you have a bear that takes a crow that is drowning, birds can't swim, as it turns out. If a bird gets its feathers wet and lands in the water, it will drown. I've seen a bear literally scoop it up, free it, and let it go. Didn't eat it, let it go. We all have these instincts to be moral and to be selfless, and to have benevolence. It is not religion that gives this to us any more than it does to a dolphin that protects a swimmer from a shark. We all have this ability. We don't need religion, and SJ said as much in her opening. Further, I think I disagree with SJ's interpretation of the data, so we'll start with Germany. I do think when you talk about Germany, you may be cherry picking a little bit and just picking one country that you'd like to use, but we will start with Germany. Germany is not actually the lowest or among the lowest in religiosity. It is actually 23rd lowest. Ones that are lower would be, say, the United Kingdom, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Belgium. These are all countries that have lower levels of religiosity. But one interesting thing about that, which is if you were to take the top 10 most secular countries on the planet, what you will find is, well, actually, let me rephrase that. If you were to take the top 10 happiest and healthiest countries on the planet, as measured by the World Health Organization, as measured by, I forget who's the other group that does this, but it gets published in Forbes, usually gets published by the UN. Happiest and healthiest countries. Of the top 10, 8 share one other thing in common. They are also in the top 10 of most secular countries. 8 of them. 2 are still up there in lack of, actually I think one of them is a rather religious country, but 8 of them are already the most secular. And when you take a look at countries like Sweden, this country has some of the highest literacy rates, highest social services and programs, and they are not relying on a religious warrant. In fact, if you take a look at, so for example, this is a list of social contribution, and I can put this up on the Codex too, social contribution index by country. So this is a list of countries and how much of, what percentage of their population is giving money to charities, what percentage are volunteering their time, and what percentage helped out a stranger in the last year. The green are all ones that are listed in the top 20 most secular countries on the planet. The red are the ones that are listed in the in the top 10 most religious countries on the planet. And what you will see here, again, we will post this list. What you will see here is that you have more of the green on the top than on the bottom. Now we can talk about individual contributions, and I'm happy to discuss that. But what you will find here is that is Germany. And they are reasonably high on the list. I haven't counted here, but they are reasonably high. It appears to be the top 15 of most charitable countries on the planet. So that, in my mind, undermines the claim that SJ made earlier. So I think we've discovered at the very least, or we've discussed charitable contributions. We've discussed the fact that benevolence exists in, for the most part, all species relative to their intelligence. I don't think Ebola is necessarily a benevolent organism, but nonetheless, I think the point still stands. And with that, I think I'm done. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks so much, Nick. And next, we will move into the open dialogue. So, forgot to mention at the start, if you happen to have questions for the question and answer period, all you have to do is just put @ModernDayDebate in the live chat and then just put who the question is for. If you want, it can be for both speakers. And super chats, we basically, it allows you to also make a quick comment towards one of the speakers that they can respond to if they would like to during the question and answer. And all the super chats automatically go to the top of the list. So, with that, thanks so much, and the open dialogue is open. So thanks for both of your statements.
Great. I want to piggyback on what he said with respect to health, because I do have some studies that I think should be pointed out that were conducted at the individual level, because both Nick and I have been speaking a little bit at the country level, and I think it's important to mention things at the individual level, because oftentimes what's at the country level, looking at one factor might not be there might be other underlying factors that help to explain some of the different things that we see. So at the individual level, Wu, Wang, and Jia in 2015 conducted a meta-analytic study, which is basically a study where you take a number of other studies and you put them together, of 2,339 suicide cases and 5,252 comparison participants. And they found that religion offered an overall protective effect. In fact, the sub-analyses further indicated protective effects of religiosity against suicide in Western cultures, in older populations, and in areas with religious homogeneity. There's also the National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse found that adults and teens who consider religion very important and who attend religious services weekly are far less likely to smoke, drink, or use illicit drugs. Another study in between 2010 and 2011 by Jamel and colleagues found that in 2013, the study came out of 5,387 young Swiss men, and they said that young men who indicated that they believe in God are less likely to smoke marijuana, take ecstasy pills, or smoke cigarettes than their atheist or agnostic counterparts. Another study by Wallace and Furman, Hill, Burdett, and Ellison Music, Islam and Johnson, there's a bunch of different studies here, found that Christians, Jews, and Muslims in studies of youths and adults who scored higher in measures of religiosity were more likely to see their dentist, take their vitamins, and wear their seatbelts, and less likely to drink and smoke than their less religious counterparts. And then the final thing I want to mention is a meta-analytic study of 147 independent studies found that religiosity is positively associated with psychological well-being. It further indicated positive religious coping, positive God's concepts, and intrinsic religious motivation were negatively associated with depressive symptoms. So I just wanted to point out a few of the studies. I've linked a number of other meta-analytic studies and that in your on here on the video, but I just wanted to point out some of these findings at the individual level, because those are direct and correlational.
Wonderful. So what was one of the studies? You said Wallace and Foreman, you said Wu and Wong, and then anyone else you mentioned?
Yeah, so I've got Wallace and Foreman, 1998, Hill, yes. Burdett, Ellison, and Musick in 2006, Islam and Johnson in 2003, Schmeli and Tamir, it's Shmueli, and Tamir in 2007. There's another one, Stark, 1971, Bergen, 1991, Wu, Wong, and Jia in 2015. And then last one with the meta-analytic study that I mentioned is Smith, McCullough, and Pohl in 2003.
All right, wonderful. Now, did they find any causal links, or was this all corollary?
It's in these kind of studies, when they do meta-analytic studies, you don't find causal results. You don't get causal results from effect sizes. So effect sizes are essentially correlations. So that's what you find in all of these kind of studies.
All right, so you can't say that it was the religion that contributed to these benefits.
No, you can say that, because when they do these kind of studies, they look at regression analyses in a lot of cases, and they come from multiple regressions. And in a regression analyses, you can look at the variance explained, and the religious components were the ones where the variance was explained. So the variance in these different things like depression was explained by things like religiosity.
Well, and it was correlated with, even the variance, it's correlated with. It's not to say that, so for example, well, I'll get to that in a second. So it's still a corollary study. Do these studies actually claim causality in it, or is that something that you are now claiming, having seen the studies?
I think you might be. Are you familiar with how you conduct a regression analysis?
Not particularly.
Okay, so what a regression analysis essentially says is you look at different outcome variables and you look at independent predictor variables. And in the independent predictor variables, you'd have things like religion. And so in the results here, the outcome variables would be these health outcomes, things like depression, suicide, and that kind of thing. And the variation explained in the outcome is from the predictor. And so, yeah, essentially they are correlational, but the way that, and sometimes in studies like this, they use the wording predictive, but in many studies, just to play it safe, they say it's correlational.
Okay.
And they might say a positive correlation, and they look at variance explained.
Okay, but so first of all, just to play it safe, well, if they need to play it safe, I think you probably need to go with what they say. Second of all, what I find interesting about that was you actually just sort of reiterated what a corollary study is, which was, you said they had one variable and then they found that by it you could predict the other, but that prediction does not mean it's causal. And here's how this is interesting and why this is interesting. If you tell me how many people, I can, based on how many people ate ice cream on any given day, I can tell you roughly how many people died on that day, period. I can tell you within a reasonably good, less ice cream eaten, fewer people die, period. That's a fact. And I can predict, based on that ice cream, how many people died. It has nothing to do with the idea that ice cream is killing people. It has to do in general actually with the temperature outside. As it gets hotter, more people go out, they go swimming, they drown at beaches, they get hit by cars, they get into car accidents, all sorts of other things happen, including they buy more ice cream. But again, based on your model, presumably what I can do is say, hey, gee, tell me how much ice cream you've eaten, and we actually, again, model this on the codex, put in roughly how much ice cream was consumed in a day. I can tell you how many people died. By your model, that seems to suggest that ice cream causes death.
No, see, I wouldn't. I would actually say that's the findings with respect to ice cream and death are probably rather spurious. I wouldn't say. I would be surprised if you can find a study that does even a correlational, significant relationship between eating ice cream and death.
We have it on the codex, and I can.
So you have a study that shows you that.
Yes, and I can link to that. We have the actual numbers for that. It is correlated in this country. The amount of ice cream consumed is correlated with death, because there's a third factor.
That means I'm going to live very long.
No, it doesn't.
I never
because
eat ice cream.
It's not a relationship. But all right, so that's, I think, my first concern is I don't think any of these are causal, and you in fact said that one can predict the other, but that prediction is not a causal relationship. I can predict based on the motions of one planet or another where one may be, but that doesn't mean the planets are causing each other. Sometimes they can be caused by a third thing, such as the sun, when its influence on them. That's why the difference between correlation and causality is important. And again, a scientist has to get funding. They have to get money, and they do this by producing results, and the most results that they can produce. So while yes, they play it safe because they don't want to be called out for saying something wrong, if it's remotely possible to say it's causal, they would absolutely do that. And it sounds to me like none of these studies actually said it was causal.
Well, and I'll have to go back to the studies to look at the exact wording in each of these, and probably would be helpful if you did that too, before we both presume that that there's not a single study that mentions even predictive relationships, because I would be surprised if none of these studies mention predictive relationships, and that speaks to
predictive
causality.
Doesn't mean causal. Excuse me. Predictive does not mean causal in any way. It just means that by knowing one value, you can predict the other. It doesn't mean one is causing the other.
Okay, well, I'm just going back to the idea of what a regression analysis is, Nick, and it's pretty basic. It's basically just saying that these different outcome variables are predicted by these independent variables, and in those studies they've shown that the positive benefits of religiosity and believing in God and church attendance. And so I'm just going to make that assessment, and we can probably just move on, because I could sit and hammer this point back and forth for 15 minutes, and it's going to bore everybody. So
Well, I think it's not an unimportant point, so let me actually cover a few things. So, first of all, I think you wrote an article on this. The article was Health Correlates of Religiosity and Atheism. And this, I think, is the article right here.
That's it.
And that's it. Perfect. So, now a couple of things about that. And my printer died. I don't have all the papers out I wanted, but... So, you suggested, well, actually, before I get to that, so, okay, that's the study. A couple of interesting things. First of all, let's talk about, one of the things that I've done is I've actually read all of the studies that you just referenced. I have printed all of them out. I have read them. And I actually have quoted and related where in your article you reference them, including the claims that you have just made, and what the authors of those claims, the authors of those studies say. Now, first of all, in every one of them, they made a number of interesting claims, but none of them, not a single one, ever claimed causality. They all said corollary. And I noticed that even in this article, you say health correlates of religiosity and atheism, but you never actually say in this article that you wrote that one causes the other. The closest you actually came to was saying that that there is evidence to suggest that there is a causal relationship, but you don't actually claim that there is one. So you may be claiming one now, but it seems like when you wrote this, you didn't think you could support that claim, at least not in writing. And the reason I think that was probably wise is, so let's take a look at Shamil and Tamir, which you mentioned. Now here, you have them listed in the same way that you utilized it just now. Jews, Christians, and Muslims who scored higher on measures of religiosity were more likely to see their dentist, take their vitamins, wear seatbelts, so on and so forth. Shamil said that actually no, their conclusion was that, quote, religiosity had a consistent adverse effect on reported health among Israeli urban Jews between the ages of 45 and 75. Further, one of the other ones that you, Wallace and Foreman was a very interesting one, because I'm not sure you represented that study quite accurately, and here's why. They studied, first of all, only the extrinsic religious expression, that means going to church, and many of these, actually, interestingly enough, found that it wasn't the religion, and this is what they actually say in the study. It wasn't the religion, it was the social participation in going to church that people needed. For example, in one of the studies that you quote, let's see, Shayun Lim talked about that actually extensively, and I can quote her directly from the study, but she also did an interesting article saying that there is a secret religion in ingredient that makes people do better, and she posted or wrote to the American Psychological Review, and she said, our study finds compelling evidence that it's the social aspects of religion rather than the theology or spirituality that leads to life satisfaction. That's what she wrote. She also said that intrinsic can actually be more dangerous. Now, intrinsic being specific belief, and 3 of the studies that you quote actually say that intrinsic motivation makes people either more dangerous, more depressed, or less likely to do things such as use condoms, which is one of the interesting ones in Wallace and Foreman. If not required, people are less likely to pursue medical treatment, maintain prescriptive health regimens, or engage in practices that can reduce harmful effects, such as condom use. Now, that is for intrinsic, and most of them say that, and I can quote one of them, and I can send this to you if you'd like too, where what they suggest is that it's just like Durkheim predicted in Suicide. It is explicitly having friends. I think I said this. I missed this. We find that friendship is the secret ingredient. So it is the social engagement in going to church, not the religiosity, which many of these said actually had a negative effect. I think that covers those. I'll get to the others, but if you want to reply, I'll give you a moment. Sorry, I've been talking a lot.
Oh, no worries. No, I'm actually glad you dug into those, because I think you're bringing up some really important points. There are different ways to distinguish religiosity, and I think you're making an important point saying sometimes we can look at what they call extrinsic religiosity, which is the idea of church attendance and that sort of thing. And in the extrinsic religiosity, there have been some negative outcomes. And so,
sorry, extrinsic or intrinsic, did you just say?
I'm talking about extrinsic. In some other studies I've noticed some negative outcomes sometimes with extrinsic religiosity. For example, they found in a different study that I don't have in front of me that people could be more racist with higher levels of extrinsic religiosity. But as far as intrinsic religiosity, a lot of times the meta-analytic studies I've seen have had pretty positive outcomes. And that's the idea of inside having this belief in God or a special purpose and that sort of thing. So that's a little bit different. So I'm glad you're bringing those up, and I appreciate that. And I think you're right to highlight the fact that friendships do matter. Getting into groups can help with people. Being social essentially is a very important thing. So I think your points are well taken.
Do you know which intrinsic studies you might be thinking about?
I honestly don't have them in front of me. This morning I listened to Inspiring Philosophy's debate with Matt Dillahunty, and he mentioned those. And so I didn't get a chance to write them down and look them up, but he mentioned those in his debate. He actually mentioned the sources in the debate. So I'll go and dig that up, and I'll leave that for James to post here on the video.
All right, wonderful. But one of the things I had mentioned was in your own post, a number of them said, from the sources that you cite here, a number of them said that there were actually explicit dangers to it. One of these, and this is an interesting one, Liam and Putnam from 2010, our findings suggest that religious people are more satisfied with their lives because they regularly attend church services and build social networks. We find little evidence that private or subjective aspects of religious life lead to satisfaction, and they later say, our study offers compelling evidence that it is the social aspects of religion rather than the theology or spirituality. Now, what I find interesting about this actually is this is Liam and Putnam 2010, and you use them. You press that study into service here where you say other studies have concluded that the personal aspects of religiosity relate to intrinsic value. So that is right here in your, where you say that it relates to intrinsic value, but Liam and Putnam, which you're quoting there, found the exact opposite. Further, Greenfield and Marks, they didn't find the opposite, but their study was in fact exclusively of extrinsic values. So was Paragament 2010, which was an intervention in the form of group meetings. I'm covering my own face, so that's probably not a good idea. They were discussing exclusively extrinsic, and so was Elliott and Green. So that is all but one of the sources that you had said related to intrinsic, which actually only discussed extrinsic, being important because extrinsic can be obtained by any other means, not necessarily religion. Any thoughts?
No, I'm trying to find exactly where I said that in this study, so I'm just trying to quickly read through this. And then
yeah, it's in yours. So it's in your. It's where it starts with, other studies have concluded that the personal aspects of religiosity relate to intrinsic motivations and belief. But every study you cite there that I was able to get a hold of, and there was only one I was not, I was able to get a hold of 1, 2, 3 others, and in all of them, they were extrinsic, and in one of them, they said that intrinsic was in fact dangerous. In fact, there are a couple of ones that said intrinsic was dangerous. So to quickly try to cover, well, first of all, Liam and Putnam, 2010, said that it was the intrinsic and not the extrinsic. So did Devereux and colleagues, which you referenced, Wallace and Foreman, Smith and McCullough, which you referenced, McCullough, Michael, Friedman, Enders, and Martin. And I can send you a list of this. But the Wu one is interesting for a number of reasons, because one of the things is their study, they mentioned that if you are in a theistic society, such as the United States, one that's more theistic, has more religion, they found that, yes, atheists there might be more depressed. Again, it's not corollary. And here's why that's extraordinarily important, and what you were talking about as predictors fails. It's because in more religious countries, again, the Scandinavian countries, start with those, they found explicitly that the benefits did not correlate there. And one of the reasons they suggested, and this was suggested by another study that you referenced, one of the reasons they suggested was because if you're an atheist in a predominantly theistic nation, you may be discriminated against. And here in the United States, Pew found that atheists are, out of 15 years, Pew found that 7 of those years, atheists ranked below rapists on trust levels. So they theorized that the reason, and you had even said in Western countries, and I find that very interesting, because what they suggested was, again, it wasn't the religion curing depression. What it was the fact that in religious countries, they suggested this, they didn't say it, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis. In religious countries, what happens is, if you're an atheist, you are ostracized. Ergo, it might look like, hey, theists are just great and everything's hunky-dory for them. And the fact that in predominantly atheist countries, religion does not have any of these benefits, according to these studies, supports reaching that conclusion. Now, a number of studies, Oculus and Horizon 2010, I'm pronouncing it bad, but I can send you all of these. Liam and Putnam, Greenfield and Marks, Parman, Devereux and colleagues, Green and Elliott, all said it's not the religion. They all said in one way or another, and I can quote how they said it, because I've actually pulled all the quotes from each of these studies, but they explicitly said it was not the religion. And Powell, Shibali, and Thomason from 2003 said that actually this study, which you said supports your hypothesis, they claimed that evidence failed to support a link between the depth of religiosity and physical health, and that they found religion or spirituality impedes the recovery from acute illness. This was Wallace and Foreman also said that it could be dangerous. Teachings of some denominations may factor for a variety of negative health outcomes, because they may expect, if not require, that you do not pursue medical treatment, maintain prescribed health. I already covered that one. And that Shamil and Tamir, which you referenced earlier about 10 minutes ago, said the exact opposite of what you actually here claimed, that they support your claim. They actually said that they found that, quote, religiosity had a consistently adverse effect on reported health among Israeli and urban Jews. So I'm not sure that many of these studies can be pressed into the service that you are trying to do. Further, this was an interesting one, current biology. Now, every study I'm about to cite, A, has in general more participants than the ones that you cited, and B, were more recent. And so let's start with current biology. This one was this was the negative association between religions and children's altruism across the world. They found that the more religious you were, your children were, the more that you were, and I don't actually have the quote, but I seem to have misplaced it, but that what they found was your children were less likely to be altruistic, more likely to be judgmental of others than children of secular parents. And that one involved 8,000 students. There was also one of religion and depression in older adults. I'll actually get to that one in a second, but the other one that I found interesting was spirituality and religious beliefs as a factor of onset depression. What this study found, this was, this was a repeat of a Nazareth study. What they found, let me actually get to this.
Well, let me
please
in here, because
I'm sorry.
I realize what you're doing is you're going through each of these individual studies, and I think one of the things I'd like to point out is, yes, sometimes the studies do have different findings for either extrinsic or intrinsic religiosity, but what you're saying is you're basically saying that the idea of extrinsic religiosity is not religiosity because it speaks to things like social groups and that kind of thing. So you're saying it's not pointing to religion, even though in some of these studies, the idea of extrinsic religiosity is called extrinsic religiosity because it includes religion. It's basically saying church attendance and practices and social groups and that kind of stuff that comes from these religious organizations ends up benefiting people. So another thing that I wanted to point out is we can each go through individual studies, and I know that's what you're doing, and saying, oh, this study said this study said that. I think it's more important probably to focus on the bigger studies, like the meta-analytic studies. And I don't know, did you find the one that I had pulled from Smith, McCullough, and Pohl?
Let me find it. I also wanted to reply to something else you had said, but let me, S-M-I-T-H. Yes, Smith, McCullough, and Pohl, 2003. Okay, so what they found was that religiousness is, quote, mildly, well, let me give the whole quote, quote, religiousness is mildly associated with fewer depressive symptoms. And I think the word mildly is reasonably important. They also found that it worked only with extrinsic religious orientation. And here's why that's important, because I think you may not have had my position quite properly. Religious extrinsic orientation basically means going to church and stuff like that. And the reason that's important is because if you're studying that, what you're really studying, according to most of these authors that they have said, like I said, I quoted one of them that said, what it is it's the friendships. It's the friendships. And I can get that going to a group of atheists. I can get that by going to the Faithless Forum. I can go that by all sorts of things. And one of the authors, I was trying to find it now, actually said that when they correlated or accounted for covariance, what they actually found is, yes, church does help because it's a social activity, but there are many other social activities that actually help more. So just because, yes, it's religion, but the question here is, do you need religion to achieve it? And every one of these studies either does not answer that, or in half the cases where they're actually discussing the extrinsic values, say that it is explicitly the social interactions, which is again what Emil Durkheim said about this kind of thing, about in particular suicide, but mental health in general, which is you need to have social interactions. If you have them, you're going to be healthy. Just because you're having them in church doesn't prove that you're getting them from church. And none of these studies were willing to make that claim. And most of these studies said, we think it's just the social interactions. Now, Smith and McCullough, again, to finish that one, found that this is an interesting one. They found that with intrinsic motivation, that is to say, not interacting with people, but just the belief, what you said in your opening, you think that a belief in God, the grounding of that is what we need and is what causes the morality. What they found was that was actually, quote, associated with higher levels of depressive symptoms, which is also what Yeager found in his 2006 study. In 2019, oh, sorry, 2019. That's what he found in the 2009 study. Let's see, and I think I may have accidentally cut off part of that. There's a lot of writing. And I know this may all seem pedantic, but if you're going to bring up these studies that support it, and again, so I've got also multiple studies here that are much more recent and with much larger groups that seem to suggest that religion is not nearly as helpful. One of the studies, too, that you had said, and I can find this and look it up, but I obviously have a number of studies here. But one of the ones that I found most interesting was you had said that they found that the extrinsic was helpful. And what they said was, yes, they found it helpful, except when they accounted for covariance. And once they did that, it was no longer helpful at all. And so I think these studies do not seem to suggest even that most of them actually state that they think it's the social interaction and not the religion. Many of them state that the intrinsic religion and beliefs are actually detrimental, and they cite that. And you can actually go through that evidence in their studies. And a few of them even state that there are other ways to get even more benefit than going to church. So it seems to me not only very difficult to sustain. And again, there's a modern one that says there isn't even really that correlation properly. And the modern one, and I can look it up in a second, about the spirituality and depression, that was in Cambridge. What they found was that that correlation doesn't actually exist, and they account for why it appears to exist in the previous one. So first of all, I think that the idea that there's a correlation is difficult to defend. The idea that it's causal strikes me as extraordinarily difficult to defend. And the Wu one actually said it wasn't, and that you couldn't claim that. And I can quote theirs.
So let me, because I feel like I'm not getting any chance to talk at all. So
right. My apologies.
There's a few, you've made a number of statements, and I think let me just go back and reiterate the fact that I told you that extrinsic religiosity and intrinsic religiosity, yes, there are differences. You're trying to split out the idea of church attendance as being something separate from being religious. And I do understand that the idea of being religious and religion and religious institutions, there are different ways to look at religion. The studies I have found have indicated in many cases that religion is beneficial, but as you pointed out, and I think this should be pointed out, different sects of, say, Christianity have different practices, and the ones that discourage people from using medicines, I agree with you. That would absolutely be harmful for people. And I would not support the idea of telling people not to go to the doctor or not to get medicine or treatment or for things like that. Another thing that you pointed out that I think is very interesting is, and I agree with it, I've actually found the same thing, is they have shown that in countries that are highly religious, or even in countries that are maybe more atheistic, conforming with the overall values of the country does help with happiness. So for example, if you're in the United States, where we happen to be 86% believe in a higher power or spirituality or God, when you're in a place like the United States, you tend to be happier if you're religious in the United States, and that's absolutely true. Whereas if you're in China, where 90% of people say they don't believe in God, you probably wouldn't be very happy if you said you didn't believe in God in a place like China. I should point out something that happened in the last century that I think is very important, that you might want to also speak to. You said, well, do we need religion? And we can look at what happened in examples in Cambodia and in Russia, the USSR under Stalin and Lenin. We can look at Pol Pot in Cambodia and Mao Zedong in China, and we can see the absolute devastation that resulted from these communist leaders who basically also were trying to run out religious institutions. And so 100 million, over 100 million people died last century, which is more than any other century combined over all of the other centuries prior to that. So if we go back and we look at what happened, and what's really interesting about that is Nietzsche portended that 50 years before any of it even occurred. So Nietzsche said, we've killed God, and he basically pointed out that we need God, and he the idea of a Marxist philosophy, Marx of course was an atheist, is something that did not work out to the societal benefits in the last century. And then my last thing I wanted to mention is you mentioned about atheists, people's perceptions of atheists. And the studies that I've seen on that is a lot of atheists also have those perspectives on atheists. I see Adam Friendon made a comment here that was kind of to that end. But the idea is, if you go back to, there was a person called Gervais, it's like Ricky Gervais, except for it's someone else, I forget the first name, but it's Gervais. And he did a study where he found that the perceptions of atheists were pretty negative, and even atheist perceptions of other atheists were pretty negative. So that's just something to mention. And then my final thing I want to mention is that atheism, the Pew polls have indicated that atheism has one of the lowest retention rates, and that people tend to become more religious as they get older. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to that. Like, for example, Antony Flew decided to get rid of his atheism when he got older, and he became, I understand, a deist. So that was kind of an interesting thing, just because he had looked at he just looked at what's going on as far as design and cosmology, and it led him to conclude that there must be a higher power.
All right. Let me see. I was trying to write down as you were, and I didn't catch all of it. So as to Nietzsche said that we should have religion?
Nietzsche didn't say that. He said that, in fact, I think I've got the exact quote. He said, he pointed out some benefits, and it's actually also in the article that you were quoting, but in his Will to Power, he said, yep, the benefits of religion, he said, it granted man an absolute value as opposed to his smallness and accidental occurrence in the flux of becoming and passing away. It served the advocates of God insofar as it conceded to the world, in spite of suffering and evil, the character of perfection, including freedom. Evil appeared full of meaning. It posited that man had a knowledge of absolute values, and thus adequate knowledge precisely regarding what's most important. And it prevented man from despising himself as man, from taking sides against life, from despairing of knowledge. It was a means of preservation. So I think that even though Nietzsche, of course, is an atheist, I think it was interesting that he was able to so clearly identify some of the benefits of religion.
All right, and that was in Will to Power?
Correct.
All right, this is Will to Power. It is the writing by Nietzsche that you are quoting there. And I think what you will find, there is a reason, and you actually also said in your article that you were surprised he didn't take advantage of that, his belief, and become more religious. The reason is that's not really in context what he was saying. And in fact, what he says is that these moralities also include truth, which Christianity has died at the hands of. It turns Christianity against itself and the Christian God. And why that is, and this gets into, let's see, but among the forces, the supreme value of service is where man should live. And I can also send this to you if you would like, but the yellow is where you actually quoted what you just said, because that was in your article and I looked it up. And the pink is the next few lines which explain that and explain why he is not actually using that as a compliment. But he is in fact being Nietzsche, and what you know of or have heard of Nietzsche is in fact true. He did not like religion, and he explains why. But he was not saying, I think, what you here seem to indicate that he was saying. Further, let's see. You were talking about all the deaths caused by. Actually, I can get into that one in a second, because I wanted to get into church again. I am not saying that, again, all of these studies seem to indicate, and here is McCullough, Friedman, Enders, and Martin. They found that it was largely attributable to differences in personality traits, social ties, and health behavior, not religiosity. Evidence in Powell, Chabris, and Thorine, 2003, evidence fails to support a link between the depth of religious, I already covered that one, Valberg, Iowa. I do want to know why a lot of these guys have religious names like Shibboleth and Islam, but at any rate, let's see, health benefits of religious attendance have been explained by the larger social networks. So it's not the fact that it's religion, it's the fact that they're being together. And again, you can do that anyway. I'm not trying to say that religion isn't a good thing. I think it's great. Go have fun at church. These things are saying that that helps, but it helps not because it's religion, and that benefit can be obtained any number of ways. And some of these articles actually suggest ways that can be obtained more than by using religion. Consequently, said Yeager, consequently, we question whether religion has the purported health benefits and whether they are attributable to religion or to social activity in general. And so it seems to me, again, to be indefensible that it's the position that church makes you happy and have a good time. I think that's a defensible position. I think that's absolutely true. To say that it's the result of religion, none of these seem to support that, and most of them question or outright refute that hypothesis. And if it's the social activity in general, then I don't see why we need religion. Now, when you talk about Stalin, I forget the others that you mentioned. I think you mentioned Pol Pot. Let's talk about Stalin.
Mao Zedong.
Oh, please.
Pol Pot.
Okay. So let's start with Stalin. Stalin was ostensibly an atheist. I believe he was. There are some who now think there's evidence he wasn't. I think he was. But the question is, well, actually, there's a couple questions. First of all, we actually, before I get to that, it turns out, so according to National Geographic, actually it's not National Geographic, it was reprinted in National Geographic, April 22nd, 2016, atheism, if it were a religion, is the fastest growing religion on the planet. This does not suggest to me that it's getting smaller. Christianity is getting smaller, Islam is getting a little bigger, and atheism is getting bigger. So I don't think, and I can have the numbers for you on that in a second, but there are some very specific numbers, and it's been reprinted in a number of other, it's an easy one to look up, but atheism, demographics of atheism, number of atheists are on the rise. Okay, scientific.
I agree with you. I think I made that point earlier. That's what's going on over in Europe, especially.
Well, in Europe, yes, but I think not 2 minutes ago you said that atheists cannot retain their numbers and they're becoming deists and theists. That's what you said 2 minutes ago. So now,
No.
are you saying
Can I
it's
clarify?
growing? Please.
Okay, no, I didn't say that atheism cannot retain its numbers. Atheism, let me be very clear. Atheism is on the rise in Europe, and I pointed that out at the outset. I wanted to make it very clear that many studies, including the World Values Surveys and the Gallup polls, have indicated that there are more atheists in Europe than there have probably ever been. So I agree with that. But I have just said that over time, a lot of atheists, the retention rate isn't terribly high. I don't remember exactly what it is, but I want to say it's about 30%. And that's from the Pew polls. And so it's over time, even though the numbers are definitely rising, the chances are that many might go back to being a believer at some point later in life. That's all I'm saying. And I'm definitely not saying that atheism is shrinking in any way.
My apologies, and you're correct on all counts. Atheism is on the rise. There is a tendency as they get older for some atheists to become deists or theists. That absolutely happens. Still, that the deconversion rate of an atheist to a theist as opposed to a theist to an atheist, the deconversion rate is at about 1 to 5. So for every 5 people who become an atheist, 1 at some point in their life becomes and actually I think it's 1 in 12. 1 in 5 is what, that's another number. I'm happy to take the 1 in 5. I think it's actually 1 in 12. As to Stalin, okay, that's the self-discipline study. Stalin was an interesting one. He was an atheist. That is, actually, so first of all, we live in the most peaceful time in history. and that is another article we have up on the Codex, but the amount of violence that's happening per capita is smaller than it's ever been in history. Now, it's higher in some places, and the news, so the reason we have this perception that it's higher is because the news just brings it all straight to us and we think it's happening next door. But when you take a look at the actual number of people who are committing violent crimes, wars, anything like that, it's lower than it's ever been at any time in history. The places where it's highest is almost universally religious places. Now, yes, Stalin and Pol Pot did a number of terrible things. When you look at as a percentage of the population, they may have had some of the killed the most number of people. As a percentage of the population, it's of the human population. It's not quite the same thing. But the other thing is, Stalin, for example, didn't do it because he was an atheist. Now, he did commit what has to be called genocide against religion, religious people. It's genocide, and it's absolutely, there's no excuse for any kind of badgering or attacking, or you can't know, and let alone what he did. But he did it because the Russian Catholic Church was the biggest single challenger to his power. Now, they actually weren't attempting to challenge it. They were on his side, but he knew they could change at any time, and he wanted to consolidate power. So he used atheism as a means specifically to attack religion. But there are two problems here. First of all, this isn't a debate on the difference between religia. Actually, well, no, you're right. This actually is a legit point, because the question is, what happens if we get rid of all religion? Does the world go to hell? So I think Stalin is a good example of that. But he was using atheism not for its lack of belief or because he necessarily supported these views, but he was using it as a tool to attack his biggest single challenge to power. And it was a deliberate move. It had nothing to do with a lack of values. And he did a lot of other terrible things. Now Hitler, for example, was a vegan. And I think it's difficult to say that he did what he did for veganism. So you have to be a little careful as to what truly motivates these people. And again, what I would stand by is that in societies where we have the most secular governments, people thrive the most. They have a longer life expectancy, higher happiness index, just almost universally across the board. And I think that says something. And I think the fact that religion no longer does the Inquisition, which, by the way, ended only about 350 years ago, the final one. But the reason the Inquisitions are no longer tolerated, the reason not just Inquisitions, Crusades are no longer tolerated is actually because we have secular governments that have removed the religious component from their governance, and in those, people thrive more and are more likely to put a stop to that kind of activity. And then, so the religious Bertrand Russell had said that it's no credit to the religious that they no longer do or believe these things. They do that solely because of the pushback from secular forces.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about a couple of your points that you made. One of your points that you made is you basically are saying people who are in these very secular societies tend to be very happy. So we should probably look at China. And would you say that people in China are the happiest? Because China doesn't, unlike the Western European countries and Northern European countries, China doesn't have the Christian foundations that have led to the way that the societies are structured there. So I would probably look at China as an example of a long-time secular country. And I'd also probably look at Russia as another example of a long-time secular country that hasn't had the recent Christian foundations that we have seen over in Europe. So I would say that if we look at happiness levels in those places, that could probably give us an answer to what a future would look like without religion. Do you think that's a fair point?
No, not remotely, because what you're doing is you're cherry picking. Like I said, if I were to take the bottom...
Is China the number one country as far as non-religious?
Please let me finish. Yes, I'm about to answer that. Please let me finish. If you were to take the bottom 10 countries that have the worst for life expectancy, only one or two of the bottom 10 would be anywhere near the top of least religious. Most of them are in the heights for most religious. Because I'm not saying that religion is universally and always bad, I'm not making that argument. Finding one counterexample of a country like China nothing to refute my argument. It still is the fact that of the bottom 10, most are the most highest religious. China is obviously an exception. And of the top 10, most are the most secular. Is there a religious country that's in the top 10? Yes. That does not demonstrate that religion is the cause. In fact, that there's only one that suggests religion is not.
Well, I point out China because I wanted to say that China has 1.3 billion people. So it's unlike any other country in the world. It's the largest country in the world with the largest population in the world. And I think that if you just look at what's going on in China and you look at how, I would, if you've heard some of the experiences over there, things like Chinese melamine, things like sweatshops and things like horrible government censorship as far as what people can do. And the government basically has been scourging a lot of Christians over there. So there's a lot of issues with China. And so when we're talking about Western and Northern Europe, the thing is again, they were founded on Christian values, unlike China. So China gives us a much better picture of what life would be like without religion. And I think that even if we look at some other communist countries, we could say the same thing, or formerly communist countries. So I think that those give us a better picture. And I'm not trying to be unfair. I agree with you to the point that, yes, they're very happy in Northern Europe. I will say that all day long. And yes, they are growing levels of atheism in those places. So I agree with you on that.
But then how does China make an accurate view of what it would look like if we have so many examples that are good?
Forgive me, SJ, I gotta cut you off. I know that you got an answer that you probably want to give, but just so we can keep on moving with the format. With that, thanks so much, everybody, for your questions. And we are...
Do we want to do a closing before the questions? I think we had said no to that earlier, but now I'm thinking it may not be a bad idea, but it's up to SJ. I have no objection, like a 5-minute close, or does anyone want that? Or
it's up to you both.
I think it would be warranted, but I'm also happy to go with the questions either way.
I think we could go back and be repetitive. I think it might be better just to get to the questions, actually.
Let's do that.
You got it. Thanks so much. With that, well, new subscribers. Scientist Mel saw you subscribe. Thanks so much. Glad to have you here. And if there's anybody else that subscribed, sorry if I missed it, but we're glad to have you here, whether you're Christian, atheist, no matter who you are. So, Adam Friended, thanks for your super chat. He said, "Go SJ, hashtag atheist for Jesus." So you got a fan out there, SJ. And Brian Stevens, thanks for your super chat. He said, "Controlling for multicollinearity and showing that all lurking variables have been removed is something a study can't do. You need an experiment." So I think, I'm not sure who it's for, I think both sides maybe used corollary data. But so if whoever wants to respond, you can.
I have no comment. I was going to try to say something clever, and I realized I don't have anything.
Gotcha. Okay. And then, SJ, if you want to, you can. Otherwise, I can move to the next one.
Yeah, I don't really have a comment on that either.
Gotcha. Brian Stevens, thanks for your other super chat. He said, multivariate analysis would allow us to calculate the R squared you mentioned. And R squared, for those of you unfamiliar, would be how much... I'm going to try to put this in a way that's simple. If you're trying to predict happiness using religiosity, R squared is, simply put, the amount of the variability in happiness, or the difference in the amount of happiness that people have that's explained by your predictor variable, in this case, example, religion, or it could be atheism, or whatever you want to use to predict it. Multivariate analysis would allow us to calculate R squared, you mentioned, and the root mean square error for our model. We cannot draw a link between causation until we run a designed experiment. So, if you want to respond,
Thank you, Brian. Because you see, Brian is a statistician, as I understand. He teaches that at the college level, so I'm glad to hear Brian's comments on that. I want to thank him for that.
Well, one of these studies was an experiment, and it was reported as a study, but it was actually an experiment. It was a therapeutic group, and they reached the same conclusion that I've said before, and again, I can make this available, but their conclusion was that it was the interconnectedness and the engagement that was healthy for people, and not the religion per se, and that you could get that engagement from anywhere. One of these studies, a couple of them, found that the R value was, if I'm using it correctly, 0.91 in the correlation, which I think is a correlation, but a very low one was the ones that they found. But,
it would depend on the sample size.
Okay. Well, you know more than I do then.
Let's see. Next one, and thanks for your super chats and your responses from the speakers. So, Scientist Mel said pool deaths increase with Nick Cage film releases. Thanks for that super chat, Scientist Mel.
That's right. I forgot about that.
She also said, in another super chat, thanks Scientist Mel, she said motorcycle deaths correlate with cheese purchases. And another one, marriage rates in Kentucky correlate with boat drownings. Don't want to get married in Kentucky.
No, you don't. Well, again, that's the point. And what was the other correlation? I'm trying to remember. There are a couple of really bizarre correlations.
If you knew I was being, hopefully you guys knew I was being facetious. The last one was, she said, hope we have learned that correlation does not equal causation. So if either of you want to respond to that, you can.
I agree.
A couple of these studies warned against drawing causal conclusions. One of them, the one that I think was sort of the most important, was the Wu study, and one of the things that he said was, this is so complicated, you really, and because it has to do with social context and who else is in the society, if you're in a predominantly Christian society versus predominantly atheist society, determines how these actually interact, and that no mental health professional should ever make recommendations on religion based on simply these studies. And I thought that was an interesting and important assertion, and certainly not one of these studies claimed in any way that there was a causal relationship.
And I didn't either, Nick. I just wanted to clarify that. I also did not say there's a causal relationship. I just said that, as you pointed out very rightly, in my title even, I called it correlates. So I did not make that claim.
You did about 6 minutes ago. 6 minutes ago.
Well, one thing I think that's very important to mention is that, and you have mentioned it, is again, like we distinguish the idea of extrinsic and intrinsic religiosity, and the idea that that some of the religious practices that are done in these places, like you mentioned, social practices and that kind of thing. The thing is that you're mentioning is, can they be done elsewhere? Well, sure. Yeah, you could go to the United, what's it called? There's a church that I know atheists go to sometimes. It's kind of a universalist type of church. And yes, you could. There's probably secular humanist organizations. In fact, the American Atheists I know just did some sort of voluntary work at their Easter event, and so they were giving out soup and doing things like that. That they were replicating some of the things that they typically see in churches, and so yes, we do see that kind of thing. So I agree with you that social groupings, social interactions, positive friendships, all that kind of stuff can also occur outside of the church. I'm not saying it can't. I just want to say that religious institutions in these studies, that when they looked at what they call extrinsic religiosity, in some of the studies they did find some pretty positive outcomes.
Okay, but if you can do all of it without the church, why do we need religion?
Well, I think if we go back to the beginning point that I made, is I'm looking at where things, if you say we don't need religion, we have to be able to look and say, are there things that are not around without religion? And two very important ones is the idea of external accountability, that I think binds people and helps people to make proper decisions even when others aren't watching. I think that's very important, and that would not come without God. And I think another one that's very important that would not be here without God is the idea that we have objective moral duties to be benevolent and to help the environment and to look for a greater meaning and purpose. And so I think, and the studies have indicated that. So I think that when you just look at those sorts of things, we've got two very important factors that are impacting all of humanity. And just like you pointed out, when I said at the front, atheists can be moral. If they don't believe in God, can they be moral? Can they have moral practices and moral actions? Well, that's the beauty of the whole thing, is that we all have this moral conscience. And I think that just helps underscore my point that there has to be an objective moral standard and a moral lawgiver for us to all have this moral conscience. Even if you don't believe in the moral lawgiver has implanted that moral conscience within you.
Okay, but if it's implanted, then it exists whether or not we have religion. So we still don't need religion, even if there is a God and he implanted it. The question is, do we need religion? Second of all, this goes also back to my original point. So if you need external accountability, what external accountability does the school of dolphins have when they protect a swimmer from a bunch of sharks?
Well, you see, I would say that since God made dolphins and that sort of thing, I see no reason why we wouldn't see animals engaging in benevolent practices. But I can also say that animals don't have a moral duty to do anything. They forcibly copulate each other, they kill each other for food and that sort of thing. So animals don't have that moral duty or those moral oughts that humans have. Humans are uniquely positioned with these moral duties.
But they're capable of morality every bit as we are, apparently, at least commensurate with what they're. I mean, if it doesn't have thumbs, it can't do some things. But
I also wanted to say, let me ask you this, Nick. Sorry. Let me ask you. This is just one quick question. If you were in a dark alley and you were confronted by a bunch of very big, burly men, would you want those men to be just coming out of church, or would you prefer that those men just coming out of church, Christians? Or would you prefer that those men were atheistic with the belief that they have no moral accountability?
Very good question. If I'm in the South and if I'm gay and I'm wearing a dress, I probably would prefer that they're atheist. And I also know you said Christians, but I said earlier, and this is important, this is not a debate about Christianity. It's about religion. So you said at the beginning, if people were coming out of church, yeah, if I was in Iran, if I was in Saudi Arabia, if I was in any number of countries, I would much prefer that they were atheist than they have a moral accountability.
Gotcha. We
okay.
should
well,
probably go back to
hear
question and answer. I'm so sorry I know that you should have a response.
Oh, you're right. Move forward, definitely. Sorry.
Next up, we have Sigifredo Sarabia. Thanks for your super chat. He said, does it not take causality to have predictions? Why link things together in the first place to even make a prediction? Why is it no longer coincidence?
It's not a coincidence, but just because two things are related does not mean one caused the other. But I think everybody here knows that. I know SJ, I think SJ has no disagreement with that, but just to whoever's talking. Just because two things are related, they can be caused by, say, a third thing. They're not necessarily caused by each other. So again, the amount of ice cream sold can predict the amount of people who die, but it doesn't mean it causes it. And you can go the other way on a causal thing. Based on the number of people who die, I can predict the amount of ice cream sold. Wait a minute, does dying cause people to buy ice cream? No, these are two facts. They are related. The question is, which causes which, or are they caused by a third thing?
Let me, I wanted to say I saw Adam Friend had pointed something out, and this also speaks to what Nick just said, but religion, it's according to the dictionary, is the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. It's a particular system of faith and worship, and it's a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. So I just wanted to point that out because he pointed out that we had not defined religion, which is a very valid point.
He defined religion? Sorry, how did he define it?
No, he just pointed out that we had not defined it. So I just looked it up in my phone just to give the definition that pops up when you type in religion definition on the internet. So
what was the definition you gave? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods, or a particular system of faith and worship, or a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance.
Okay, so that's the Oxford definition. Sounds good. Thank you. I'll take it.
Gotcha. Next up, thanks. Let's see. Thanks for those answers. And then Sigifredo Sarabia, thanks for your super chat where he said, is it more beneficial to have an imaginary friend named God, in parentheses, extrinsic, or be an atheist and call yourself God, in parentheses, intrinsic? And that's the question. And then says, if evolution relies on what's the most beneficial for society, why still no God?
I don't know how to parse the second one. The first one, in my experience, it's always better to believe true things than false things. True things can still get you into trouble, but you are less likely to get into trouble, and you're less likely to cause a net harm if you know true things. When you don't know true things, it becomes real difficult. One of the great examples is the Black Death. So I think it was late 1300s, if I recall. So people start dying. They go to the church and they say, okay, why are people dying? They said, well, we talked to God. He said it's witches. We need to kill witches. So they started burning women. And much more importantly, I hate to say in this circumstance, they started burning cats. They started killing cats because that was the familiar of the witches. And they didn't know which cat was a familiar and which one wasn't. So they just committed genocide on cats. I don't know if that's like caticide or felinicide or genocide, whatever. They started murdering cats. This was a problem because bubonic plague was spread by mice and rats, and the cats were keeping that population in check. As soon as all of them vanished, boom, the population explodes, and then bubonic plague becomes a huge problem. This was caused in part by ignorance of what the real problem was, and more importantly, guessing when you don't have an answer. When you don't have an answer, the best answer is, I don't know. A guess is more often than not worse than not having an answer.
And I like the point that he made. I think the truth is very important, and it brings back a nice phrase from the Bible that says, and the truth will set you free.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
A lot of good lines in the Bible.
Next up, Cesar Prado Sarabia, thanks for your other super chat. They said, SJ, 12 religions that believe in God in book. Which is true? Why Christianity outside biblical sources? And then it says, why not kill for it? Because in God they trust. Hashtag Isaac.
Well, number one, it's the idea that Jesus came down here. Jesus is very unlike any other religion. So in the Christian religion, we actually have a representative who came to the world and made it very clear to everyone that he is the Lord, he is the Son of Man. And he said to the Pharisees when they were just arresting him, he said, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father, coming in the clouds. And that was a reference directly to the book of Daniel, which is why they got so upset, and they basically decided that they were going to crucify him. And so Jesus is unlike that. And if I wanted to look at extra biblical sources, I probably would advise that people look at what Gary Habermas has come up with in his minimal facts idea. And Gary Habermas basically said, well, in Christianity, if we look outside the Bible, we can find people like Bart Ehrman and others who agree with a number of different facts. And one of the biggest ones is the way that the early apostles, Peter, James, Jesus's brother, his half-brother, and Paul, came to Christianity and came to believe and preach for centuries. And the best explanation for that, along with the other minimal facts that people who are skeptical scholars agree with, is that Jesus rose from the dead. So just looking at Paul, who was once Saul, he was on the road to Damascus. He basically had a conversion where he said he saw Jesus, repeated that in 1 Corinthians 15. He also mentioned that in Galatians. And then if we look at Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and James, who thought Jesus was beside himself and tried to get him to stop his ministry, we look at that kind of thing and we ask, well, why did these men do what they did? They were in a position to know the truth, and they decided that they were going to follow Christianity. And despite the fact that they were persecuted very, very often, they were jailed, they were stoned, they were imprisoned, they were all martyred for their beliefs. And so just looking at that sort of thing, to me, is a very compelling case for Christianity.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up. Oh, here's the list. Thanks. Thanks so much for your super chat, Justin T, who said, question for both. Has either of your positions shifted after this debate? What did your opponent do well, or what could the opponent have done better?
Oh, good questions. No, I don't think my view has changed much. My wife or my girls like to play practical jokes. So if they spike this with LSD, if I suddenly say I've been converted, the chances are something's But no, it hasn't changed much. I think a number of things SJ had done well. I think, in particular, I do think it's worth discussing the negatives of atheism. I think to say it doesn't come with negatives is a really foolish position. I know atheists who take that, and that's just simply not true. I'm also not sure, though, how much that's necessarily relevant to the debate, because that's not directly, I mean, it's tangential to the debate topic, but I think that would have been an area to explore a bit more, just what are the harms of atheism. But I think that's where she could have maybe done some more work.
Got it. SJ?
Good. Well, I think I like how Nick actually went and found all those studies that I'd looked up, and he looked at the full studies, and you know, maybe I had cherry picked some results, and I'll be first and foremost to admit that. I'll go back to the studies and I'm going to look through it, given what Nick said about those, and see exactly where it's coming up with what he said. And my computer basically took a nosedive, my initial computer, and I lost my hard drive in January, and so I had to get another computer. And I'm pointing that out because I don't have really quick access to those studies that were in my other computer before this happened. So I'm gonna have to go pull them off from the library and look that up and make sure that his points that he made were actually exactly what was said. So I wanted to say that's a great idea.
I'll send, like I said, I'll send it to you, and I'll send you my notes, because I have extensive notes and quotes and page numbers and all that other stuff, so I'll send it to you. But they say to error is human, but to really foul things up requires a computer.
Yeah, my computer, everything gone. I lost everything. Even I lost my, what did I lose? I lose my dissertation. I lost everything. So it's, I lost some studies I was doing. I wasn't able to recover a lot of stuff. It was pretty bad.
Sorry to hear that. That's a bummer. We just to jump to another one. Brian Stevens, thanks so much for your super chat. He said GPH is against an offensive war on Al Qaeda. No idea.
GPH?
I think it's somebody else in the live chat. I think he's headhunting, but so if you don't know how to respond, you don't have to. Sigifredo Sarabia, he said, if debate was, do we still need atheism? Why false?
If the debate was, do we still need atheism? Why false? I don't think we have necessarily needed atheism in the past. I think that we would have benefited from it. I don't think we needed it. I think we are increasingly in a place where we do need it. If you were to take a look, and speaking of corollary studies, and this has to be, you have to be very careful, this is a corollary study, but if you want to see who denies global warming or says that we don't need to fix global warming because God will fix it for us, the people who do that are overwhelmingly more religious than not. And they either don't understand the science or they deny it for one reason or another. And that's a corollary study, so you can't say that religiosity causes denial of global warming. But global warming has a less than zero chance, in fact, a reasonably decent chance of wiping out the human race. We may no longer exist anymore if we do not fix the problem. And the biggest indicator of why we are having a hard time getting traction is because there are people opposing it, and the people who oppose it are overwhelmingly religious. And that is a very good, but not the only, example of why religion is actually starting to become a very serious problem that we are going to have difficulties with. So we may not have needed atheism, but I think it would have helped, and we need it more and more.
Okay, so I wanted to speak to the only major secular societies that have promoted atheism in the last century, and what I brought up before with respect to Cambodia, China, Russia, and other countries like that, is we've seen the devastating impact of having an atheist communist sort of a leader. And so atheists tend to align with communism, and we've seen that communism fails time and again. Communism fails basically because people do not have the incentives or the motivations to do their very best work. And so we can see the outcomes of that sort of a view, and it's a bad thing. So I know that I'm not sure exactly what Nick's view is on socialism or that kind of thing, but another benefit that we've seen right from Christians is the whole idea of capitalism, and capitalism again is consistent with the Bible.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, let's see. Scientist Mel said, secularity encourages education. We need an educated population.
I'd like to actually
Christianity encourages that too. Think about the starting universities. So we have Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard. I could go on and point out all of these major universities that started from Christians. And Christianity absolutely supports the idea of an education. In fact, if you go back and you look at where some of the things that have guided society are, we can look at Martin Luther basically as being somebody who promoted the idea of education. We can look at Martin Luther basically said he wanted to have compulsory education for all. That was something that he pointed out, and James Keller and Harry Good pointed that out, that he made that claim. So Christianity absolutely is consistent with education, and the education of women. That wasn't something that we saw back when Christianity first came about.
I'm going to disagree. I know it's a shock to everybody. I'm going to disagree, and here's a couple reasons why. Yes, I think in many cases Christianity has been pro-education. Islam was actually much more pro-education for a good deal of time until they banned mathematics. But before that, Islam was leading the charge into education and investigation, mainly because the Prophet Muhammad required that we investigate the universe. So, hey, these things are good. Again, would we be investigating without religion? No. B, I think you're going to find no more opposition to education or investigation, scientific investigation, than religion. They don't necessarily object to all of it, but certainly anything that even remotely begins to touch on or contradict either the Bible or some sort of, or the religious establishment or anything like that, is fiercely and viciously opposed. The opposition to evolution, which is absolutely a fact, and there still is opposition, but at least the Catholic Church is on board. But before they were, the opposition to evolution and to established facts and to what we're finding is fierce, and it is based exclusively on those specific objections are based exclusively on religious warrant.
Gotcha. Thanks so much.
So I wanted to.
I'm so sorry. Just to keep moving through the questions.
Okay.
Is that I'm going to try to. Scientist Mel got that one. Sigifredo Sarabia said, "Is atheist American, or maybe it's is America atheist if it's not quote unquote one nation under God?"
One nation under God was added in
in the 1950s.
1950s. All right. So, and I think a number of the founding fathers were at a minimum deists. A number of them, what was it? Thomas Jefferson? Who I should find a quote because it's a worthwhile quote. But a number of them said that they really actually detested religion, that you should. Thomas Jefferson questioned with boldness even the existence of God, because if there be one, he must approve of the homage to reason more than that of blindfolded fear, which, by the way, is not necessarily, I do think there are Christians who as well see that as a legit thing. I think that's good. But yeah, we were not founded as a Christian religion. Did Christianity maybe contribute? Here's one of the other interesting things. What if Alexander Graham Bell hadn't have existed? People say, oh my God, we'd never have had the telephone. What if Darwin hadn't existed? We'd never have found evolution. No to both those claims. Alexander Graham Bell beat Elisha Gray to the patent office by 4 hours on the telephone. 4 hours. In another 4 hours, somebody else would have gotten credit for the telephone. Darwin, who was the other guy? I forget who the other guy was.
Short and pithy as possible. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Just
all right. Sorry, almost done. There are always other people doing. If Jesus hadn't have come along and put forward the ideas that he did, somebody else would have. And many of his ideas he took from people who had come up with the ideas before.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up. Sorry to rush you guys. I know I've been interrupting. I hope you forgive me.
I'll be faster. My bad. No, I'll be faster. Sorry.
No, you're all right. As Movie Theory said, Lim 2010 said, quote, though a high number of secular friendships were associated with life satisfaction, church friendships seem to involve something that lifts satisfaction more. End quote. Nick quoted Lim 2010 earlier, but left this out. Cherry picking, and they put in caps.
Oh, Nick, you're doing it too.
No, I beg to differ. First of all, if she did say that, that would be great. Again, what Lim said explicitly was it was friendship that was the missing ingredient. And there are other studies, and in fact, actually, I thought it was Lim. I'm going to look that up now because there was one of the studies, and I thought it was Lim that said that. So yeah, we find that friendships are the secret ingredient that make people happier. Our study offers compelling evidence that it is the social aspects of religion rather than the theology or spirituality that leads to life satisfaction. We find little evidence that that other private or subjective areas of religiosity affect life satisfaction. That's what Lim said. So if there's something else, I'm more than welcome to hear it, but there is another one of these studies that actually did account for other social engagements and found that church was less. So if Lim found that it was more, great. But there's one here that found that it was less, and Lim certainly doesn't seem to support, at a minimum, the conclusions that have been drawn in this discussion.
Gotcha. Next up, we've got scientist Mel said, some of the worst, in caps, people I have known are Christians. So my guess is that's for SJ.
Thanks, scientist Mel.
Okay, that's all right. It was short and pithy. All right. Of Flamio, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, said, do your backups. I think they're referring to SJ's your computer crash. Sorry to hear about that, SJ. And Movie Theory said 2015 meta-analysis in all caps said, quote, in general, studies have shown that religious spiritual interventions decreased stress and depression, end quote. Nick cherry picks in bold letters.
Did they give the study? Well, I've been quoting the studies directly, so if somebody thinks I've been cherry picking, great. I can make this available to. We will put this up on the Codex, and if you think I'm cherry picking, great. But I actually I put it up here so that people could see it, and hopefully they're recording it and they can see it, and I will put it up as is on the Codex. The only concerns I have is that it's all sort of notes. It's not necessarily easy to read. But I'll put up I will put this up on the Codex within the next 24 hours.
Gotcha. And then that is linked in the description, by the way. I didn't have it linked in the first few minutes of the debate, but I got it in there. So just so everybody knows, you can access that in the description box below. Next up, scientist Mel. She said, Cambridge study had 8,000 people showing no link with religion helping depression, 2013.
That is correct.
SJ?
No comment. The thing is, there are a lot of studies out there, and I think that's why we like to find the meta-analytic studies that summarize the results of numerous studies. Those are the best ones to rely on, because findings sometimes are as Nick actually rightly pointed out, a lot of times the findings might be skewed in some way towards the biases of the people conducting the studies. So unless we have replication and meta-analytic studies, sometimes we don't have results that should be necessarily generalized.
We'll put up the results of that study too. I know the study she's talking about, and it actually explicitly explains why a number of the previous meta studies
Forgive me, I just want to make sure that we get to as many. Joe the Graphics Guy said, SJ, do you believe that evolution and climate change are facts? If you don't think they are facts, is it because of your religion?
No, actually, I am, as far as climate change, I teach my students that the sea levels are absolutely rising, and a lot of it's human caused. And so I actually use the example of Kiribati in the South Pacific, that is an island system of a number of atolls that are going under because of rising tides. And so climate change absolutely is a fact, and we're contributing to the atmosphere in negative ways. And the sheer size of the population and the levels of methane and other sorts of gases here in the world have actually contributed significantly to the melting sea caps. So yeah, I support any studies that are looking at climate change and any initiatives that are out there to get rid of climate change. One thing I don't support, though, is exactly what Alexandria Ocasio has come up with, because Cortez is come up with, because the idea that everyone's going to stop flying and start taking trains and we're going to be able to retrofit every single building in the United States is extremely expensive at a price tag, including her other green initiatives of $93 trillion. So no, I don't. I think we need to be aware of climate change, but we should also understand that we can't save the world and get rid of some of the things that are going going on out there. As far as evolution, I don't know a theist who doesn't support what they call is evolution of adaptive, species adapt to their environments over time, and species sometimes get separated, and then perhaps a new species forms after a certain number of years. The issue with evolution is, I think when you look into it really closely, is you realize we don't fully understand very much about our origins. There's a lot of theories out there, but evolution doesn't give us a great explanation of our origins. And the sheer amount of time that it would take for us to evolve from what they propose as far as a single cell is beyond that which the Earth has been present. So,
gotcha. Next up, thanks so much. We are through the super chats. Thanks for your patience. We are working on, by the way, people have brought it up. Sometimes it's like, well, if we put the super chats at the front, sometimes we don't get through. Pretty much most of the time, we don't get through as many questions that are not super chats. We're trying to work on how to figure out how to balance that out. So we got a week until our next debate after today, and we'll be thinking about a plan. So Salem Coop has a question, and debaters, if you're okay, I'm willing to go longer if you're okay with it, but I want to respect your time. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, how okay are you with us continuing in 2 more questions?
8.
I'm fine.
Okay, thanks for your patience, and we'll try to go quick. So Salem Coop asks, Modern Day Debate, what are some good books both of them would suggest?
Is there a book about anything in particular? Or? Actually, let me show you this book. I haven't shown this one. This is, it's called How Christianity Changed the World with Alvin Schmidt. So I would highly recommend that anyone interested in these kind of topics might want to pick up this particular book.
The book I would probably most recommend is it's a really good book. Influenced me greatly. It's called The Water Thief. You can find it on Amazon.com. You can find it on it's a marvelous book, and I think you should really go get it. Don't worry about the fact that my face kind of looks a lot like the author on that one. I highly recommend that book. But when I'm not being silly, one of my favorite books in the world is Lord of the Flies, but if we're talking about specifically in 1984, if we're talking about topics relating to this, anything by Hitchens and Harris, I highly recommend.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. SJ?
Well, I'll add a couple other books. I strongly recommend C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. That to me was a game changer. I went from a sort of a non-believing, very weak Christian to a very strong Christian just starting from reading that book. I'd also recommend anything by William Lane Craig. He's an amazing author. Anything by Gary Habermas, another great one out there. Mike Licona, Nancy Pearcey. I just interviewed a few of them on my channel. Hugh Ross, another great writer. So I would definitely give credit for those.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Jen with an N ask Eshe what is the difference between sacrifices to other gods and the biblical God telling people to kill whole tribes?
I think sacrifices to other gods, and I think that Jen's probably making reference to some of the stuff in the Old Testament, and so. Like, for example, with the Canaanites. So there was a Canaanite population that basically was doing a number of egregious things, including sacrificing their children and that sort of thing. And God gave them warning that the Israelites were to go into Canaan. And if anyone happened to be left in Canaan, that they would basically fight them. And so it's very likely the Canaanites took the women and children out of Canaan and retained the warriors who wanted to fight against the Israelites when they showed up. So the Israelites, when they went into Canaan, they were told that this land belonged to them, and so they basically fought Canaan and took the land away.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Iron Charioteer. For SJ, do you feel Christianity and religion is under attack? If so, why?
Yeah, I think we have evidence around the world that there's a lot of persecution going on, especially in places that are Muslim. For example, we've got Egypt, where we had the Coptic Christians who were all out on the beach, and many of you probably saw that, where they were beheaded on television. It was awful. We also see what's going on in churches and synagogues and mosques all around the world. We actually have a lot of people going in and gunning down innocents inside of these religious institutions. So it's actually pretty awful. And it's not just Christianity. We're seeing it. We saw it in New Zealand, for example, with mosques. So we're even seeing it there.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then next up, Tyler Durden asks, question for SJ, where are the property rights mentioned in the Constitution?
I think it's Section 8, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, I was just looking at that. Give me just 1 second here. Well, while you talk, actually, let me look for that, but you guys can move on to another question, but I'm going to find the exact section because I was just reading that a few minutes ago, so I should remember that.
No problemo. Next up, I have a feeling it's going to be for SJ, but question for SJ. Let me see if there's one for Nick, so Nick can get some action for the Q&A. So let's see. You have a lot of fans, SJ, a lot of questions. So let's see.
I'm the guy nobody wants to take to the prom. I'm just going to sit here. It's okay. Just go ask SJ all the questions. I understand.
That's funny. This is one for both. Kadema. Question for both. Define religion. I think we kind of talked about this already, but just to be sure, Nick, that you had a chance to define it yourself.
She gave the Oxford definition. There's a Merriam-Webster, a few others. I mean, I think... the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially in a personal god or gods. I normally, actually, as an anti-theist, I have absolutely no objections to deism. There's a number of breakdowns I won't get into for time, but when I talk about religion, I normally, personally, am only referring to theistic religion, but in this case, religion applies exactly as SJ defined it.
And I wanted to go back to that one question. It says the writings and discoveries in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and also the Third Amendment of the American Bill of Rights give citizens the right to grant or deny housing on their property to soldiers. So, and the Fourth Amendment protects the property of citizens from unlawful searches and seizures. So just to answer that initial question.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Let's see. Scientist Mel, thanks for your super chat, just came in. She said, Nick is awesome. I am so glad he did so much work. Thank you for accurately representing the science. So, if you want to respond, you can.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate that. I'm a big fan of science. My wife has a PhD in biochemistry. I'm a fan of science, and I actually have a undergrad, at least, in psychology, so I study this stuff. It was a lot of work, but I appreciate the thanks. Thank you.
Gotcha. Next up, SJ, did you find that source?
Oh, with the Constitution?
She did. She said it.
Yeah,
Oh,
I just read that.
Okay, sorry, I was scanning through the question and answer. With that,
you're busy. You got a job.
I know that we didn't get through all the questions, and I'm really sorry about that, friends. We try to get through as many as we can, but to be honest, we have quite a lot many more, and we've already gone over half hour or so of what we had said.
Get to the ones that say, why is Nick so awesome? Why is he so dreamy? How does he keep that beard so gray? And how does he keep his belly so big? Those are the questions I want to hear.
That's funny, yes. So I'm sorry to everybody. Your questions are excellent. It's been a really good time, and I want to say thanks to the speakers. It's really been a pleasure to have you. We appreciate you spending your time here. And so again, just want to say thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, you bet. So with that, everybody, we hope you keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable, and have a great night.
Thank you. Are you guys there?
I'm waiting until he says we're out.